Well, terrific. That's a good segue, because my poem, of course, is now about time. But the last two poems that I'm going to read in our session speak to our common background as musicians, music lovers, wanderers in the climes of the musical Empyrean. And so how I learned about time, this is very specifically about time as a musician. When you say, oh, that musician has good time, in the jazz world, you're saying something about her or his command over playing in the time grid, in time framework, not faltering, not speeding up, not going too slow. Those are the basic commands that you need to develop. But then if you become a more sophisticated player, whether you're an improviser or an interpreter, the way a classical musician would be, you're getting into these very fine nuances where your ability to shade the time within phrases from note to note becomes critical. And so that's the time that this is about. How I learned about time. And Louis Armstrong is my pole star as a musician and also as much else. I love him on a lot of levels. But as a musician, I've learned more from him about playing the trumpet than certainly anybody else, although I still fall far short of understanding what he himself knew and could do. We're all scrabbling around at the foot of the mountain that he sits on. How I learned about time. After listening carefully to Pops and wondering where he got those solos from, after a lifetime's listening and playing, putting the notes he chose into the order that he used and at the proper time to figure how those phrases came to him. Studying the accents on the 1 and 3, he had the saxes set for him on all those 30s Louis Russell sides. Remembering what Ruby said about it. When you're in 2, you think in 4. When you're in 4, you think in 2. I still was puzzled how the hell he did it. How he thought to start and stop those phrases where he did. The way he felt the time. After a few more years, I realized how much he had to know to play that way. To make a phrase more like a melody, you had to know the chords inside and out and play not so much on as over them. On the unissued take of Swing That Music, done with Jimmy Dorsey, after all those high Ds on the 1, he syncopates some phrases in defiance of the time that for decades left me in confusion. When to play with each note giving way and how to tell when each led to another. I felt a little somersault each time I heard it, deep below my solar plexus, and couldn't tell when the next note was coming. I must have listened to it 50 times and tried to figure it 100 ways. My body simply couldn't process it. Then it happened. Without even trying, I suddenly could feel the way to play it. Like waking up one day and finding out you knew the way to wiggle your left ear after a lifetime when you never could. And now it wasn't even hard to do, but no one could have ever told you how.
Well, I'm not a jazz-centric music lover, but I had no trouble understanding everything about this poem, knowing what time meant, knowing who Pops was. I'm not sure I know who Ruby is, but it doesn't really matter to me in terms of appreciating the poem. I think You do a fine job of describing your conundrum, this feeling of not being able to comprehend it or process it, this kind of magic going on that you couldn't get to the bottom of. And yes, that's what does, I think, in many realms of life, that is what happens. You kind of just put in the time, the unavailing, seemingly unavailing time, suddenly it avails. And you can't explain how. No one could have ever told you how. That all is completely convincing. I love this comparison of you knew the way to wiggle your left ear after a lifetime when you never could. I can wiggle my left ear. So I have a little trouble identifying with that, but that's my problem, not the problem. The only I like to know how to wiggle my right ear. That's a different question. One little detail, which I'm curious to know if you meant this or not, is these two lines. When you're in two, you think in four. When you're in four, you think in two. Those depart from the pentameter to me, and those lines are actually in four. They're duple. All the rest of the poem to me is clearly in blank verse, except for those two.
Yes.
So I don't know if you intended that or not, but those two lines are actually either in two or four, but they're definitely not in five, the way I hear it. Is that?
Yeah, that is intentional, but it's because, well, I should back up. First of all, you're right. You don't have to know who Ruby is, but just for curiosity's sake, that's Ruby Braff, who is a fabulous cornetist who learned everything he could from Louis Armstrong, as I have tried to do myself. And basically, he was talking about when you're improvising over a rhythm, because in the older jazz was played over a 2-beat rhythm. And then when swing came in, the rhythm went into a 4-beat rhythm. And so what he was saying was, when you're improvising over a 2-beat, don't be pushed around by the 2 beats. Imagine that you're playing in 4 so that you'll phrase over the beats. Likewise, when you're in 4 and you've got a flowing rhythm of 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, subdivide it into 1, 3, 1, 3, and then you play in and around 2 accented points, not 4. So it's very specific advice given to a certain kind of jazz improviser. And I couldn't.
Which, by the way, I got completely. I completely understood that. That's not alien to even classical music, where people say, think over the bar lines as phrases,
yeah,
or and so on. Those kinds of guidances come up in classical playing as well.
Well, but I wanted to do something a little different rhythmically with those lines, because that's what they're dealing with. And so you're exactly right. They're rhythmically different. They depart. I would just add that I learned how to wiggle my right ear when I was 40. And I say I learned, I wasn't trying. I just thought of wiggling my ear and it moved. And I realized immediately that I had never had that feeling before. So I know I'd never moved it before. And then I discovered that I could do it on command. But
I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying, opposite from you, Dan, I still don't know how to wiggle my left ear.
I was just going to say, Al, isn't that sort of like how we learn to sing?
How so?
Well, because you think about a note and then produce it, and you don't think about the mechanics of producing it so much as thinking about the note you want to produce.
Yeah, well, that's true. I think that's another example of the overall visualization technique that are now taught in all kinds of human endeavors. It's a big sports thing that you visualize your golf swing, for example, and then that helps to groom the neural pathways in your brain to make your muscles follow that pathway and do what you're imagining. So yeah, I think that you're exactly right, and that there are yet many other things that we come to in exactly the same way. But good. I'm glad that for the musically educated, you don't have to be a jazz specialist to get what I'm talking about here. Although, if I could play you the passage in the solo, you would have a better insight into how impossible it is when you're playing to then syncopate the way that he does.
Well, I've heard there are a number of versions of this on YouTube. I have a feeling I didn't get to the one that you're talking about, the unreleased one with them. But the one I did hear, and maybe it was, I don't know. But even whatever version I heard, I think I heard what you were talking about. It's so subtle. It's like in the cracks between the cracks of time, sort of the little extensions and also those little Phillips on the end of each of the little sort of downward.
You may
slur.
You may have heard the one that I'm talking about. He does it. There are two. They're both from 1938, and there's one version that was released on a 78, and then there's another one that was not released at the time that came to be released in the 50s or the 60s or later, and that's the one that that contains this stupendous artifact of playing with time. That, but basically, Armstrong's understanding of the time sense is tremendously profound, and so you can hear the kind of thing that I'm talking about in all of his early work in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Mm-hmm. But this one particular one, I mean, and I solved a lot of those over 40 years of effort. Now, in fact, now I can hear how to play it, but the part is so high, I probably couldn't play it live because he had this tremendous range too. But at least I can physically grok it now. So there's that. But anyway, so that's it for me. Now for the fifth and final essay. What do you have, Dan? You have a longer.
I have a long one. I thank you, Al, for letting me read this one. I've only read this one at a reading once. It's too long to read at most readings. It's not that long, but it's too long to read at most readings when you only have 15 minutes. It just takes too big a chunk of it.
Yeah, well, that's why I'm glad that you can do it here, because I often read poems of mine that are too long for readings too.
Yeah, I've heard you say that.
Here.
Yeah, and that's why I felt at liberty to, and it certainly is about learning. It's more explicitly about classroom learning than any of the other poems I read. The only little bit of information I'll give you is there's a couple of things related to the instrument, the organ, little lore in here. I think whoever's listening to this probably knows this already, but those little buttons that you pull out on the organ called the stops, hence the phrase pulling out all the stops. When you pull out one of those, you engage a set of pipes. The organ can have scores of sets of pipes, and some of those pipes are meant to imitate the sound of a woodwind instrument. So there's one called flauto. It says it right on the, they use the fancy highfalutin European words, but the one that says flauto, when you pull that stop and play the organ, it sounds like a flute. And there's one called hautbois, which is French, I think, for oboe. And when you pull that stop, you hear the organ is suddenly making the sound of an oboe. And that comes up in this poem. So this poem is called Love Story. It's in 7 sections, 7 numbered sections. Some of them are mercifully short. And I'll give you the numbers for each one. So Love Story, number 1. Oh, by the way, this one, unlike the other ones I've read, is not in meter or rhyme. This one is free verse. Love Story, 1. What does it say? That of everyone I've known, the one I want to talk about is the prof I took my first theory from. Theory as in music theory. 2. His name, to limit him to his last, as he did with us, was Morrison, a little guy, typically in tweed, checkered vest, bow tie. Nice enough looking. You didn't have to be queer per se to want to touch the waves of his dark brown, brilliantined hair. Though his best feature may have been a rich baritone, subtly engruffed with the smoke of constant cools. 3. His big, handsome, honey blonde wife was a small-time mezzo I took some voice lessons from. Not many, just enough for the two of us to realize we liked gassing together too much ever to get anywhere. Before she was his wife, she'd been his student at a women's college down south. I remember her telling me that whenever he was up in front of her class, there wasn't a dry seat in the house. I still can't believe that she actually told me that. But anyway, moving on with the poem. Number 4. Early on, he was explaining what a key is, likening the downward tug of the tonic to the pull of gravity. All very interesting, though I was especially taken with his observation, Passim, that pieces in C invariably return to sea level. 5. In handing our nightly harmonizations back, he'd make a point, not to say a right, of reading out the grades, including an F or 2 usually, these delivered with all the gruff he could muster. My classmate Young and I, we thought those Fs were the funniest vocables going, would loose their like at each other whenever we ran into one another. Young was even lucky enough to absorb a few of the real things. I still remember handing in something that broke most every rule in the harmony book, it being art I was up to. Next morning, Miss Cotton, B. Mr. Randall, A-. Mr. Brown, Mr. Brown. So many no-nos, Mr. Brown. And yet to speak of the rules of harmony is to speak of what genius did as a rule. Infraction with cause is permissible. And these infractions of yours, Mr. Brown, they leave me no choice but to award you the grade of F. Six. Happening past the campus chapel one day, I heard a wraith of organ coming from it. Ambled up the walk, tugged open the door. A lesson he was giving Randall. I saw Morrison see me as I slipped into the choir loft to listen. Flauto would be a little obvious here, he was saying, though being obvious doesn't necessarily make it wrong. A point he supported by pulling a stop and wafting a few bars. Au revoir is also possible. Now that one hears it, very possible. Any preference, John? John? Who was Randall to get to be John? From whom, in the event, nothing in reply. And you, Dan? Dan. Which would you choose? All I could manage was the truth. That they both sounded good. Yes, he mused, they both are good, but different. And if they're different, one must be better, yes? 20 years, and that question's still right where he hung it in the musty air. 7. I passed that course and on to Theory 2 with Prof 2, and didn't see nearly as much of him, though I did join the choir which he conducted, and sang for him for the rest of my time there. For a while after, I'd hear of him from Young, who'd stayed on for law. Seemed he'd started appearing around campus in open-necked shirts and gold chains, and then had stopped appearing. Rumor had it he was off drying out somewhere. Young claimed to have suspected from the first. Something about the way he'd drawn on those cools. By the time he'd returned, his wife had followed a graduating voice major even unto Queens, her 2 kids in tow. Last I heard, he was back at his several stands, sans the chains, but still with the open shirts. Me, I tend to see him in his tweedier incarnation, as he was rehearsing the choir one morning, if without his jacket, in Carissimi's Jefta. We were working on its great closing chorus of lamentation, when it came to me, in my perch well up in the tenors, to put an especially hard C on the Carmine in Carmine Doloris. It cracked like a rifle shot, in its gruffness cutting with equal ease through the whole curtain of sound. Up came his muttered, "Marvelous."
Oh, this is great. A lot of the word play, the use of words is great, and you coin some phrases that feel like they're more common and well worn than they actually are. We loosed what's the loosed one? When they're calling, we would loose their like at each other.
Oh,
whenever
yes,
we ran
yes.
another. We would loose their like at each other. That's a beautiful phrase. I mean, it should be a common phrase, but I'm pretty sure you made it up. Also, there are three entrances of the word gruff. Well, it's gruff twice, and then gruffness at the end, and they had to have been carefully placed. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I wanted that to be a kind of leitmotif.
Right.
The things that are introduced at the beginning of the poem recur. The gruffness comes back, the cools come back, the cool cigarettes,
Yep.
and the wife, even the wife comes back.
Yeah.
And the F's.
And the F's, yes, they.
And I was really looking forward to hearing you say how he said the F.
I gave it a shot. I did my best.
Yeah, nice.
So
It's fun. It was fun.
So there is a point around which, I mean, this is a marvelous evocation of a character and a situation and a set of relationships, but it also turns on the 2 lines about when if two things are different, one has to be better. And you don't commit yourself to a position on that. You just say that you still think about it. If they're different, one must be better, yes? Well, I think it's great to ask that question, because I don't know about you, but sometimes I would say yes, and sometimes I would say no. So let me put you on the spot. How you don't have to reveal it in the poem, and you have not done so, but how do you feel about that?
Just what you said. I mean, I can't answer the question. It's one of those great aesthetic conundrum. I remember when he said that. This is all true, and I was sitting up there in that choir when he said that. I was electrified.
Yeah,
because I realized that brought to a head a conundrum in all the arts. I mean, the enlightened answer is that anything is good. It can be good in the right context and the right so on. Particularly in the climate I think we're in now, to say that one thing is better than another is considered bad form. Everything is good. But he was more a hard ass. And
yes.
And you know what? When you have to play this piece, well, here it comes. I mean, are you going to pull the flute stop or the organ stop to play it? It's a binary choice. Now, you could say, well, if I get to play it twice, then I get to have it both ways. But that's cheating. If you could only play it once, what will you do? I mean, this is like the railroad car where you wanted to run over 5 people to kill your mother or something. It's one of these philosophical conundrums. You
Right.
got to pull that stop. It's real choice, a real aesthetic choice. And you might answer it with, well, I'll flip a coin. Since everything is good, I'll flip a coin. But would you flip a coin? I don't have an answer to this. I just think it pointed, as music often does. Any question in the arts is posed more pointedly and more clearly in music than like in any other art, because ultimately it's kind of abstract music. It's pure tone and pure relationships. And I just thought that posed the question. I don't really have an answer. I think I would feel uncomfortable flipping a coin. That doesn't feel right. But the only alternative, assuming you only get to play it once, is that I'd have to choose. And how, on what basis would I choose? I mean, I don't know. I don't have an answer for you, except that, well, if they really put the squeeze on somebody, then maybe they would choose. Well, you know, if I only have one chance to play this thing in my life, I think I'd go with the oboe stop or whatever it might be. But I don't know. What do you guys think?
What's your take, Claudia? I'll defer because I have some things I'll
would-
add after you.
I would have to hear the context. I've heard some really fine organ playing, organ music, and concerts, and watched how it's done, and it's fascinating. I've never played the organ though. I've never played the organ.
But you understand that the dilemma, if you did play the organ and you were presented with this binary choice, do you anticipate having difficulty choosing one over the other or not?
You asking me or Claudia?
I'm asking Claudia.
I think I might have a feeling about it at the time if I were really familiar with all the different stops and the piece and so forth. I mean, one is more shrill, one is more floaty, cloudy.
Well, I want to take it bring it down to the ground, to the abstract ground on which all these things are based, and say a couple of different things. First of all, I think that, for example, as poets, we make choices all the time between the better word and the almost as good word. And sometimes it's not so clear what the better word is, and sometimes we waffle. But basically, we commit ourselves to coming up with a fair copy that we send out and let other people read. And essentially, we're staking our claim on that word. So I think that we're by habit inclined to say two things that are different. One must be better, yes, as Morrison said. Now, having said that, as an improviser, I can tell you that confronted at any one moment of what note I'm going to play, I only think of the note that is to me the best note as I'm playing it. I don't choose it in advance. So that's a little bit a different way of framing the dilemma, that it's not a deliberate choice made at a moment of reflection. In that case, it's a choice made in the middle in the heat of action, and you do not have the luxury of thinking about the alternative. You just have to know. You have to play the next note, and that's the next note that it has to be. Now, sometimes you make a mistake, which is to say you think to play the note, but what you physically produce is a different note. And there's some great quotes by different jazz people. Miles Davis said, there are no wrong notes. But in fact, it's possible to make a mistake and play a note that you didn't intend. But what you can do, if you do that, is you can make the wrong note into a right note by what notes you play immediately afterwards.
Right.
And so it all comes down to the fundamental question for me being, are you making a decision at a moment of repose or in a moment of action?
I think that's a completely important distinction. The model of art making that's behind the incident in this poem is a premeditated model,
Exactly.
not a spontaneous or an improvisatory model. So
Yeah.
it's composition versus improvisation. Although even there, it gets a little blurry because every improviser, I think, even in jazz, what's Charlie Parker doing up in his room all week long, playing over and over again, practicing? He's practicing riffs and stuff, which he's going to use in his improvisation. And when he's on the road playing at 80 gigs in 90 nights, is he really starting from scratch every time? I don't think so. He's taking something that he's done in the past and maybe feeling free to depart from it and so on. You're the jazz man, so you know better than me. Versus, and I'll just take the flip side of it, composition, as I say somewhere in something I wrote about a composer, at the tip of the pen, the composer's pen, he or she is always improvising. There's nothing but improvisation. That next note that you write down at the tip of the composer's pen, improvisation is all. So the dichotomy or the opposition between improvisation and composition there's no, hard and fast line. I would just throw that out there too. But having said that, I think what you just said is, from a practical standpoint, is completely right. It's a different challenge, a different act.
Yep.
To do it in real time versus to have, as you properly put it, the luxury of premeditation.
So a couple of things about that. I have a friend who's a composer, and I annoyed him rather profoundly once when I said that, well, if you can improvise, you can compose. Because he could compose, but he couldn't improvise, at least not the way I was talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
But I take your point, Dan. But to go back over the ground that you touched on with even with Charlie Parker, in practical, the practical fact is that you're exactly right, that you're building on things that you've worked out before. Sometimes to get through a night, when I had my first job, the first time they gave me a solo, I didn't know how to make up a solo. So I had to memorize a solo played by somebody else because I had to play something in that chorus that worked. And so I didn't invent any of it, but I presented it and it worked. So jazz players are always looking for what works. And to that end, you may well use something that has been effective in the past. And there are famous examples of solos and parts of solos. The classic example is the Ray Nance bridge on Take the A Train, which is written by Billy Strayhorn and done by the Ellington Orchestra for the next 30 years. He played on the recording, he played something on the bridge that was so good that it was on the record, and every trumpet player after that in the band played the same solo. And I've played Take the A Train a million times. I very often played that very solo on the bridge because it's so good. So there's always an amalgam of what you have prepared and what you're making up on the spot. However, my sense of the rigor of improvisation is such that I respect the people who are trying as much as they possibly can to create not 8 bars at a time. I mean, not to replay something that's put together 8 bars or even a bar, but to literally improvise from note to note or from every note or every couple of notes. That's what I aspire to. Most jazz players do not do that. You're exactly right. But the ones that do it more, and Armstrong is an example, Lester Young is another example, Parker is another example. The ones that really try to do it as much as they possibly can are the ones that I take the most inspiration from. But you're right. I mean, it's a physical pursuit. And sometimes you got to give your brain a chance to take a breath the same way that your lungs have to take a breath.
Yeah, I'm going to say one quick thing and then just say the last couple of things about the poem I'd like to say. Beethoven in his sketches would sometimes write, his sketchbooks survive when he was working out a piece, composing a piece. But he had something that scholars call a continuity sketch, where Beethoven has written yay much of the piece, sort of maybe the bass, and then off he goes with just one line. Really, it looks like he's improvising with his pen. He's going off into the unknown. It's kind of, the handwriting shows it. He's just winging it. Later, he'll come back and clean it up, and maybe he'll discard it. But that's to my point, that even a composer, like at the moment when that pen touches the paper, you know, it's an open season there. Who knows what's going to come out of your pen at that point.
Okay, so let me ask you this question. Is it your sense that when Beethoven did that, I mean, he was writing one line. Now, any one line can imply a lot of other underpinnings in the harmony. He's not even just giving a figured bass, where you can infer from a single line. You can restructure the harmony from that. He's not even doing that. But when you're going, my sense, if I'm writing a line, because I'll write a melody and then later I'll go back and try to figure out what the harmony is that's implied by that melody. And I have a sense that there's a particular harmony that's correct out of the possibilities. So do you think when Beethoven was doing that, he had that kind of sense, and I'll just fill what's in later? Or when he went back later, he was also choosing from a range of possibilities implied by the one line that he'd already written?
What you just described is also something that he does. And I think there's no one can get inside Beethoven's head. But the scholars that have looked at this single out certain sketches seem to have a kind of freewheeling nature that looks like Beethoven is, in effect, improvising on paper. Having said that, what you say is absolutely right. He knows that there are other cases, I'm sure, where he knows the melody already, and he's just getting it down to be now filled out with the bass and the harmony and right, which instruments play. So what you say is absolutely part of his procedure. So, you know, no one's going to know. I mean, this is part of the fascination of thinking about these things and looking at those sketches, is to try to imagine what the hell is going on in that.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks for mentioning that stuff. I find that all very fascinating.
Yeah. I know we're running. I'm just going to say very quickly about the poem. I do mention a piece of music called Jefte, Jephte,
yep,
by a composer called Carissimi, a middle Baroque, sort of middle 1600s composer before Bach, before Handel. I can't commend it to you enough. It's about 30 minutes long. It's like a pocket oratorio setting the tragic biblical story of Jefte, who says, if I win this battle, I'll sacrifice the first person I see when I come back home. And the first person he sees is his daughter, Jefte. And so she goes up into the mountains to prepare herself to die. It's impossibly wonderful, that piece. The other thing I'll say is that, I don't know if this came across, but if you're in a chorus, which I was in, you really can't affect anything. You're one of 80 or one of 40 or whatever it might be. But what I wanted to, I hope, communicate, maybe for people who've been in choral singing or something, is that one time I actually did something that made a difference to the whole piece. I put in this word, carmine. I went carmine, big, strong K, to bring out the anguish of it. And he was down there conducting. He never looked up from his score, but he said, marvelous.
That's nice.
And I knew that he had heard what he did out of that. As I said, cutting through the whole curtain of sound, he heard my K and he liked it. And so here, this guy that was so hard to please is giving Fs right and left. And so it's such a hard ass. I'd done something that pleased him. And I don't know if that came through or not, but in case it didn't, people listening to this YouTube, if they want to hear it again, it's hard to get all this stuff when you're just hearing it. But that was at least part of what I was intending to communicate. Thank
No,
you for
I-
indulging me.
that-
Let me say that.
That's definitely there, and it brings the whole story of this character and your relationship to him to a really nice, rounded conclusion. So the poem would be much less if you left out the last part. This is terrific.
Great. Thank you both
Great.
for everybody for indulging me on that.
Well, there's a lot to talk about it, and I'm not going to worry about the time. So, okay, Claudia, what's going to be your last offering here?
Okay. Well, my last offering is also a multi-part poem, and it actually is about something that happened in adulthood, later adulthood, middle age, I'd say. And so it's called Skating Lessons.
Okay.
One, the music starts. I glide. I seek nothing, await nothing, lean into curves, discover how a turn signal becomes the turn itself. Raised hands spin me, turn me into a pilot who will sacrifice control for a touch gained by spurning gold, a winning streak born of ambition's absence. 2, over the ice, no assertion, only surrender. Not to be courted, rolled, or cajoled. The current I ride, never foreseen, only awaited, learned without asking. 3, compressed below the ice, embossed in lines smaller than circles scratched in its face, hidden in corners the Zamboni misses. Dreams are the turns I close my eyes to skate. 4, under the frozen surface of a pond was a baby. I ran to break the crust and found the child alive. From this dream I gathered, yes, have children. The message had a hibernating twin. Ice will revive you. 5, what is this new force then that pushes outward from a dream's center, gliding, stroking, spinning? Ice has become a friend that teaches silence because it has no way of saying never, impossible, regret, or even beauty.
Great metaphor. Great metaphor.
Thank you.
Wow. How old were you when you learned?
To skate?
Well, this kind of skating, yes.
Well, I tried it when I was in my teens and couldn't do it and couldn't stand it. And so after, I would say many years later, I tried again. Well, in my 40s, late 40s.
Well, it's extraordinary the way you describe it.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary description of an extraordinary thing.
Right.
Yeah, I think Elizabeth Bishop once said there were 3 things she wanted in poetry or something, or 4, and one of them was mystery. And I think this poem in places attains to deep, wonderful mystery to me.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Particularly section. I mean, I get I get basically, and this is not uncommon to hear in talking about any endeavor, particularly in the arts. You sacrifice control. I mean, this is back to maybe Al's talking about improvisation and so on. If you surrender to the flow, some people call it the flow, or sacrifice control, sacrifice ambition, take your hands off the wheel, basically, and let these forces or this force flow into you and through you, that can take you to places you can't, there's no other way of reaching. So that is described, I think, in sections 1 and 2, born of ambition's absence. That states it actually pretty pretty directly. Here's cajole. We had a cajoled in Al's poem. Here comes cajole for an encore here in your poem.
Yeah.
Learn without asking. This is the wise passiveness. The be receptive. Don't exert control. So I get 1 and 2. In 3, something much more extraordinary happens to me. That this completely mysterious image compressed below the ice in lines smaller than the circle. And I know the circle scratched in his face. When you do figure skating, you scratch literal circles in the ice as you carve the figures in the ice. Hidden in corners, the Zamboni misses, the Zamboni being the machine that cleans off the ice.
Yeah.
Dreams are the turns I close my eyes to skate. Well, I can't even begin to paraphrase that, except that it's something under. It's literally below the ice, something other than in this poem, inaccessible, and maybe only accessible through this kind of experience that you're describing. And then, as if that's not mysterious enough, comes this astonishing part 4. And here's this dream, although you don't know it's a dream until you get down to I guess, the 4th line. And then this incredible leap. From this dream I gathered, yes, have children. Yikes. That's a real leap. And it's just, to me, magical and marvelous. I'm not going to explain it. I'm not even going to try. If you want to, go ahead. But you don't, it's just one of those things that poetry can do. And then even more, ice will revive you. That's even more mysterious still. You're not, I don't know what you're being revived from, but it doesn't matter. These are what Freud called the dream work, or whatever he called it. This is deep stuff going on here, deep, mysterious stuff. And then when you get to the end, or even beauty, that is astonishing. It teaches silence. It's truly transcendent. It's beyond even saying all these things, kind of negatives, never, impossible, regret. Even something as wonderful as beauty, it can't even, it goes even deeper than beauty. It's infinitely deep and mysterious. Let me see if I can, it's a force that pushes upward, outward. And when you first, it's a friend that teaches silence, teaches that lack of ambition, teaches don't shut your yap, let this happen to you. Because it's not going to object. It's never going to say never, impossible, regret. In fact, it's so profound, it's not even going to say beauty. It's even more profound or deeper than that. So these are remarkable moves, as they say in the poetry workshops that you've done here, and in skating too, actually. So I find that quite extraordinary, really.
Thank you.
Remarkable. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's very kind.
Oh yeah, no, there's no doubt. I feel the same way. And at the very end, you know, although we traffic in words, you're capturing something that you define as coming from a silence that has no way of saying any of the words. So that's why it doesn't even say beauty, because beauty is a word that we use to suggest something else. And so this is coming from the source beneath the wellspring of, that we see, the artifacts that come to us as words. This is the origin. So yeah, it's everything Dan said. I feel the same way about this. And it's got its own kind of arc too. You start out and you think you know where you are and what's going on. You go, oh, well, okay, she's skating. But you take it to such different places. It's a great thing. I'm glad you brought this. It's a great one to read last too, because I think it's so strong.
Thank you. I just want to say, Al, it, in a sense, maybe it's a little less mysterious if I say that a lot of this has to do with the same phenomenon that you were describing when you described making decisions out of action in music.
Yep.
Right? It's so different when you're in the process.
That's not less mysterious to me, though. I mean, that's just a different kind of mystery. How we do that.
But it's a way to relate to it, though, because I think we've all done things like that.
Yeah. Well, it's a help, but I haven't done that thing, and so it's fresh for me. You know.
Yeah. Well, the time that I started skating, which only lasted a while, was after a crisis had been overcome. And a work colleague said, "Why don't you go to skating? You know, they have a open skate night once a week, and you can go, and you might have that." Yeah. So it was perfectly timed for me.
Well, I'm glad that happened the way you describe it for you.
Yeah.
Great. Wow. Well, at the risk of going into overtime, I'm still going to read my last poem, and I'm dedicating it to YouTube because we all love Mozart, but I didn't start out that way, and that's what this is about. Although it's about more than that, because Mozart is about more than that. How I learned to love Mozart. In music, I preferred at first the more dramatic gestures. Mozart didn't speak to me the way Beethoven did. I granted that the fault was mine and I was missing a whole world of expression others prized. But just as in the eye, I felt the heart could have a blind spot to a kind of greatness plainly clear to anybody else. When I first met the girl, I didn't know that lately she'd committed to and been thrown over by the great love of her life. Stunned, she stayed behind. He went away. For months, we spent a lot of time together. She warmed to me, and I became convinced in time I didn't want to live without her. Then he returned and said he'd been mistaken. Could they go back to how it was before and move away together as they'd planned? She admitted when she spoke to me, her heart was torn, but what to do about it? I told her she could never be with me the way I wanted until she was free of what she'd had with him, that she should go and live with him and give it every chance. We agreed that it would take a year at least for her to know if it was right, and that we shouldn't be in touch at all. I promised I would spend the year alone. All that year, I accepted day by day the arrows of emotion piercing me. I exposed my heart, and ceaselessly they found it out. But not to magnify their power, I made no attempt to struggle. I let them pass on through, as though they were those particles to whom mass is as nothing. I felt no pain, but I was being changed. When after a year I learned that she was to be married, I could let it go. I'd lasted through the harrowing, and so I felt that I was ready to move on. One day, I listened to the dissonant quartet, which opens with a strange, disjointed passage, as though every part is posing both a question and an answer. Musing on a troubling in the heart, it drifts as though the mood will never lift. Yet 22 bars later, like the sun streaming through the clouds, a melody emerges. Simple joy in a clear voice, buoying the spirit. Suddenly, my feelings opened up, and I met Mozart, soul to soul, a lifelong source of consolation.
Beautiful.
Too bad about that girl.
Yeah, very sad. But I think I listened to the Dissonant Quartet after reading this.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and recognized it as something I had also listened to in a time, a comparable time. So
Really?
it really has, and it had a similar effect. Yeah. It's an amazing piece of music.
It is totally amazing. Particularly that introduction is completely, but of course
Yeah.
also the sun bursting through the clouds, just like you say, when the introduction is over and the first theme comes in. It's amazing.
But but Al, you portrayed this just perfectly. In the narrative, and then introducing the music as completing the narrative, which it does.
You know, there's a lot of people have different ideas about music and what it is and what it's good for. And we're living in an age when classical music is viewed as some kind of elitist fare. Mozart's about life. That's I could not have come to the feeling that I came to except through that piece of music. That's what music does. It has that power. And so people that go through their whole lives not realizing that or slighting its power are just living dry, impoverished lives, really.
To me, this is a very ambitious poem. I mean, you're covering a lot of ground here, and it's not uncommon for people to like Beethoven and not Mozart. Mozart can seem like music box music compared to Beethoven.
Yeah.
He isn't music box music, but he can seem that way. And so I can identify with your struggle particularly if you come to Beethoven first. I actually, for some crazy reason, came to Mozart as a little 3-year-old or whatever before I came to Beethoven.
Oh.
So I already realized there was something magical about Mozart. But so I can identify. I think that makes many people, I think, will identify with that. In fact, to this day, there'll probably be people that'll read this poem and say, yeah, you know what, I still feel that way. Beethoven sends me, and Mozart just seems like tinkly stuff. And it just takes something. Now, your something is this experience with this woman. And did this actually, do you really think, as the poem suggests, that it was literally that loss of that person? What do you use a beautiful word? I lasted through the harrowing.
Yeah.
Is that real? Do you think that specifically? I think I know the answer to this. Is that what opened you up to the depths of Mozart?
Well, here's what I think. I had to go through what I went through for that music to suddenly be opened for me to identify with what the music was doing. I had to have, Zora Neale Hurston has a great statement in her novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God. She said, you have to go there to know there. And so I had to go there. I had to experience a very specific kind of pain, long drawn out, undramatic pain that didn't provoke a reaction, a big reaction. It was
a non-Beethovenian pain.
Right. It was banked fires that smoldered and smoldered for a very long time, because I had the emotional capital to feel that I was in great pain every single day of that year. But I didn't. I did not feel that pain because I allowed it to go through me. And I did that consciously. I didn't know it was going to have the musical effect that it did. But after I thought about it, after I did finally get what was going on, I realized that my perception of Mozart, particularly late Mozart, is that he had to go there, to know there, to write there. You know, that he understood this very specific process of being transformed by a very particular kind of pain. And, you know, Schubert is writing out of pain. Beethoven is writing out of pain. Mozart is too, certainly later on. But each one of them it's a different kind of transformation because it's a different kind of pain.
I agree. I mean,
one thing that that this reminded me of also was Dante in the Vita Nuova. Did you read that?
No.
Oh, okay, because it's a little book, sonnets and then commentary, and then another sonnet and then commentary, and he's describing how he met Beatrice, and what happened and so forth. And he describes a dream in which he encounters love as an individual demands that he turn over his heart, and love proceeds to eat the heart.
Yeah.
And that's what your poem reminded me of. The harrowing.
Well, good. That's what it should do. And you know, I'm grateful to that woman and the vagaries of fate that put me through what I got put through, because it deepens you, you know.
As you took me through that, it got me thinking of just a couple of quick things. Mozart said in a letter to somebody, there's a day never passes when I don't think of death.
Right.
And that's not the kind of thing you think about of Mozart. But then if you listen to the Mozart Requiem, you'll have no trouble believing that. Not any trouble. And many other pieces of late. Mozart Requiem is also very late Mozart.
Oh, yeah.
He died having.
Yeah, he didn't finish it.
He didn't finish it. The other thing, for this crazy reason, it reminded me of going through something and being marked by it, changed by it, coming out the other end. I just want to recommend to people, Bartók wrote 6 string quartets. The 5th of them has a central movement. It's a 5-movement piece. It's kind of unusually a 5-movement piece. And the central movement is itself like an arch. It has an A section, a B section, and then the A section returns. So it's like an arch within an arch. And the A section is a lively Hungarian-ish dance. And the B section is a kind of troubled, wild thing. And then it returns to the happy A section. But having kind of been through the B section, the A section can't be happy the way it was.
Oh.
So simply happy as it was before. And stirring around in the background is still this troubled feeling that kind of leaks out of the B section and kind of, not pollutes or taints, but troubles a little bit the untroubled A section. When the A section comes back, it has lived through the B section. The music shows the effects of having lived through that. I don't know, it's just an association that occurred to me.
Yeah, well, life conditions life. You know, so I've always been particularly attracted to the 4th Bartók quartet.
Oh, man,
I'll go back and listen to the 5th one again after you described it.
Yeah, the 4th is, well, we both can't commend these quartets. The 4th one can be a little tough at the beginning. In fact, the great critic Charles Rosen said when he first heard Bartók's 4th quartet, he was physically nauseated.
No kidding.
Yeah. And I was the first time I heard it, I said, what? It's the most dissonant, crazy at the beginning. But I got older and I'd heard more modern music and I came back to it.
Yeah.
And I mean, the first part is still challenging, but then it moves into other things that are, I think it is my favorite of his.
Yeah. When you get to the pizzicato movement, I'm just blown away by that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the central movement there, which is one of his so-called night music pieces, where it's kind of a misty Transylvanian forest and there's like crickets and birds and stuff.
Yeah.
It's wild. And I'm not wild. It's much deeper than wild. It's Only Bartok wrote movements like that. Marvelous.
Oh, yeah. Yep. Well, this has been a fabulous conversation. I really thank both of you. We've gone over time, but I don't care. What's life for? If you're following the gleam, you don't count the minutes.
Well, I'm grateful for you to conduct all these shows, which are a source of continuing enlightenment, nourishment, and pleasure to me. And I thank you very much for inviting me on, Claudia. It's such a pleasure to read these wonderful poems of yours and to be able to share this with you. It's been great.
I really enjoyed hearing your poems and reading your poems too, Dan.
Thanks.
Yeah, this is.
Thank you.
It's good. Well, I'm without further ceremony, I will say goodbye, but we'll all meet again on the other side of the end. Farewell.